I was organizing the last of my grandmother's keepsakes when my phone chimed with a bank notification. I glanced down, expecting the usual account balance update. Instead, the message that flashed across my screen made my heart skip. Deposit? Complete. $179,42,000. I froze, the antique photo frame in my hand suddenly forgotten. My grandmother's inheritance had finally cleared, just as my husband of 6 years had mysteriously decided to take a business trip that couldn't wait. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the suburban home that Ryan and I had shared for the past 4 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everything about this day should have felt normal. Sorting through my grandmother's belongings, planning dinner, waiting for my husband to call from his hotel. But that notification had sent an odd chill. Through me, something felt off. I set down the photo frame and sank into the living room couch, still staring at my phone. My grandmother had always been secretive about her finances, telling me only that she'd take care of me someday. I had expected, perhaps, a small nest egg, enough to pay off our remaining mortgage. Not this, not a sum that could completely change our lives. Ryan and I had been struggling financially for the past 2 years since his construction business hit rough waters. We'd been living on my teacher's salary, carefully budgeting every expense. He'd become increasingly distant, often staying late at the office, claiming he was working on a plan to turn things around. I had believed him, supported him, never questioning his dedication to our marriage. My fingers hovered over my phone, debating whether to call and share the news. Something held me back. We'd talked briefly this morning. The conversation had been oddly formal, with Ryan asking pointed questions about my bank accounts and when I expected my grandmother's estate to be settled. At the time, I'd thought he was concerned about our finances. Now, with the inheritance sitting in my account, those questions took on a different tone. Instead of calling Ryan, I found myself opening our shared cloud storage, where we kept important documents. Something about his questions this morning had planted a seed of doubt. I began scrolling through folders we rarely accessed, not even sure what I was looking for. And then I found it. A folder tucked away in our tax documents labeled Legal Consultation. It was dated 3 months ago, shortly after my grandmother had passed. With trembling fingers, I clicked it open. The first document was a consultation receipt from Whitman & Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of. The description simply read, "Initial divorce consultation." My breath caught in my throat. Divorce consultation? 3 months ago? I scrolled further, finding a draft email to the law firm that Ryan had apparently saved. My eyes darted across phrases that felt like physical blows. Significant inheritance expected. Waiting for optimal timing. Best strategy to ensure favorable settlement. The room seemed to tilt as the full picture emerged with devastating clarity. Ryan had been planning to divorce me, not now, but specifically after my inheritance came through. He had been waiting, calculating, positioning himself to claim half of what my grandmother had left me. I sat there, my body numb, mind racing through the past 3 months. His sudden attentiveness after years of growing distance. The suggestion that we merge our separate accounts into a joint one to simplify our finances. His insistence that I include him as a co-beneficiary on my grandmother's estate, just in case anything happened to me. All those late nights at the office while he was actually planning his exit strategy, once he'd secured access to my inheritance. The pain of betrayal burned through the numbness, igniting something I hadn't felt in years. Rage. Pure, clarifying. Rage. How dare he? How dare he pretend to love me while plotting to take what my grandmother had worked her entire life to leave me? My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Ryan's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it, suddenly seeing the man I had married, in an entirely new light. Not the struggling entrepreneur who needed my support, but a calculator, a manipulator who had seen me as nothing more than a future payday. I declined the call. Instead, I took a screenshot of the divorce consultation receipt and the draft email, sending them to myself at an email address Ryan didn't know about. Then I carefully closed the folders, leaving no digital footprints of my discovery. As the evening shadows lengthened across our living room, I made a decision. I would not confront Ryan, not yet. I would not give him the chance to spin his lies, to create some explanation that might weaken my resolve. No, I would meet him at his own game. If he wanted a divorce after accessing my inheritance, I would give him exactly what he wanted, just not in the way he planned. I opened my laptop and began searching for divorce attorneys in our area. Ryan had consulted with Whitman and Associates, which meant I couldn't go there. Conflict of interest. I needed someone just as calculating, just as ruthless. Someone who would help me protect what was rightfully mine. An ad caught my eye. Bradford Legal, specializing in high-asset divorce cases. The website featured a stern-faced woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper tagline. When everything is at stake, don't leave your future to chance. This was exactly what I needed. Someone who would understand what I was up against and help me outmaneuver the man who thought he could use 6 years of marriage as an investment scheme. I scheduled a consultation for first thing tomorrow morning, requesting their earliest available slot. Then I texted Ryan, "Miss you, can't wait to catch up tomorrow. I have some exciting news about Grandma's estate." As I set my phone down, I felt an odd sense of calm replacing the initial shock and anger. The betrayal still hurt. It would probably hurt for a long time. But now I had a plan. Ryan thought he was the one in control, the one making strategic moves while I remained oblivious. He had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, I would take back control of my life. And when this was all over, when Ryan finally realized that his plan had backfired completely, I wanted to be there to see his face, and his lawyer's face, when they realized they had severely underestimated the woman they thought would be an easy target. I picked up my grandmother's photo again, tracing her determined expression with my finger. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered. Not just for the inheritance, but for teaching me to stand up for myself. The pieces were set. The game was about to begin. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of the documents I'd found flashed through my mind. Significant inheritance expected, optimal timing, favorable settlement. Each phrase was a knife twisting deeper into my chest. This was Ryan, the man who had stood before our friends and family 6 years ago and promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. For richer or poorer. The irony wasn't lost on me. Around 3 a.m., I found myself sitting at our kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside me. The house felt different now, tainted. The framed photos of our honeymoon in Costa Rica, the hand-carved anniversary clock Ryan had given me for our 5th anniversary, the matching coffee mugs with our initials, they all seemed like props now. Pieces of an elaborate stage set designed to keep me playing my role while he orchestrated his exit strategy. "It can't be true," I whispered to myself, the words hanging in the empty kitchen. There must be some explanation. The rational part of my mind grasped for alternatives. Maybe the consultation was for someone else, a friend or colleague. Maybe he was gathering information to protect our assets for some other reason. Maybe I had misunderstood the context entirely. I opened my laptop again, pulling up the screenshots I had taken. No, there was no mistaking it. The consultation receipt clearly listed Ryan's name. The draft email referenced my wife and her inheritance. There was even a mention of our anniversary date as a suggested timing framework. Previous anniversary, marked 5 years, which is significant for asset division in our state. He had researched this thoroughly. He had planned this meticulously. Still, a small, desperate part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was Ryan, after all. We had built a life together. We had talked about having children, planned our dream home, mapped out our retirement. How could all of that have been a calculation? A long con culminating in this final betrayal? I pulled out my phone and stared at our last text exchange. Ryan. Just landed. Hotel is nice. Meeting. First thing tomorrow. Miss you. Me. Miss you too. Call tomorrow? Ryan. Definitely. Working on something big. Can't wait to tell you. Something big. Was he referring to the divorce he was planning? Or the inheritance he thought he was about to get his hands on? My finger hovered over the call button. It would be midnight where he was, but I knew he often stayed up late. One call, one direct question could clear this up. I could simply ask him about the legal consultation, hear his explanation, watch how he responded. But then what? If I confronted him now, over the phone, he would have time to prepare, to cover his tracks, perhaps even to accelerate his plans. No, I needed the advantage of surprise. I needed to be strategic, just as he had been. I put the phone down and closed my eyes, trying to recall anything else that might fit into this disturbing puzzle. There had been changes in Ryan over the past few months, subtle shifts I had attributed to stress or his struggling business. He had been meticulously organizing our financial documents, suggesting we update our wills, asking pointed questions about my grandmother's estate. He had also been increasingly attentive after years of growing distance, bringing me flowers, for no reason, suggesting weekend getaways, being more physically affectionate. I had been pathetically grateful for the renewal of attention, thinking we were finally getting back on track after a rough patch. How blind I had been. How naive. As dawn broke, I went through the motions of my morning routine: shower, coffee, appropriate outfit for meeting a divorce attorney. I chose a simple navy dress that projected competence and composure, even though inside I felt like I was fracturing into pieces. Just as I was about to leave, my phone chimed with a text from Ryan. Ryan, morning beautiful. Just got out of my first meeting. Great news. I made some connections that could really turn things around for us. When does the estate payment come through? We should celebrate when I get back. The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Turn things around for us. There was no us in his mind, only what he could extract before his planned exit. With trembling fingers, I typed back a response. Me. That's wonderful news. So proud of you. And yes, good news here too. Looks like the estate might be finalized. Soon. Can't wait to plan our future. I hit send and felt a strange mixture of disgust and power. I was playing along with his charade, but with a crucial difference. I knew the truth. For the first time in this relationship, I had information. He didn't. The drive to Bradford Legal took 30 minutes, time I spent alternating between crushing grief and steely resolve. 6 years of my life had been built on a foundation that was now crumbling beneath me. 6 years of supporting Ryan through his business struggles, of being the steady income when he couldn't contribute, of believing in his dreams when no one else would. Had any of it been real? Had he ever truly loved me? Or had I simply been a convenient economic support system until something better, my inheritance, came along? By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the sleek downtown office building that housed Bradford Legal, my grief had hardened into something else entirely. Whatever genuine love I had felt for Ryan was being consumed by a new emotion: determination. I refused to be his victim. I refused to let him profit from betrayal. As I stepped into the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. The woman staring back at me looked composed, almost serene. Only the tightness around her eyes and the firm set of her jaw betrayed the storm raging inside. 15th floor, please, I said to the other elevator occupant who stood by the buttons The elevator climbed. I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath. The woman I had been yesterday, trusting, supportive, oblivious, was gone. The woman stepping off this elevator would be someone new, someone who fought back. The doors slid open, revealing a tasteful reception area with Bradford Legal displayed. In understated silver lettering on the wall, a receptionist looked up as I approached. "Good morning," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I have a 9 a.m. appointment with Catherine Bradford. My name is Olivia Mitchell." The first step had been taken. There was no going back now. "Ms. Bradford will see you now," the receptionist said, gesturing toward a hallway of closed doors. I followed her to the last office on the right, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Catherine Bradford stood as I entered, extending her hand across an immaculate glass desk. She was exactly as her website photos had portrayed her. Mid-50s, silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a precise bun, eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Mitchell, please have a seat," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "How can I help you today?" For a moment, the practiced introduction I had rehearsed during my drive evaporated. How could I possibly condense this betrayal into a neat, professional summary? "I need a divorce lawyer," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Then, clearing my throat, I added more firmly, "One who specializes in cases involving significant assets and deception." Catherine's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. "I see. Before we continue, I should inform you that our initial consultation fee is $500 for the hour. Does that work for you?" I nodded, remembering the $1.7 million sitting in my account. "Yes, that's fine." "Good. Now, tell me what's happening." I took a deep breath and laid it all out. My grandmother's inheritance, Ryan's mysterious business trip, the discovered legal consultation, the calculated timing. As I spoke, Catherine took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally nodding but never interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and studied me for a long moment. "Mrs. Mitchell, Olivia, please." "Olivia, what you've described is unfortunately not uncommon. People change when large sums of money enter the picture. The timing of your husband's consultation and his apparent planning would suggest this isn't a spontaneous decision on his part." Her matter-of-fact tone was oddly comforting. This wasn't some unique betrayal. It was a recognizable pattern to her, something she had seen before and knew how to handle. "The good news," she continued, "is that you've discovered this before. He could implement his strategy. That gives us a significant advantage." "What do I do now?" I asked, hands clasped tightly in my lap. Catherine tilted her head, considering. "First, let's talk about the inheritance. When did it arrive in your account?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Has your husband had any access to these funds yet?" "No, it's in my personal account that he doesn't have access to." "Keep it that way," she said firmly. "Do not transfer any portion of it to joint accounts. Do not use it to pay off any joint debts. Do not mention the exact amount to him. In fact, if possible, I'd suggest opening a new account at a different bank entirely and transferring the funds there immediately." I nodded, making mental notes. "Second," she continued, "we need to gather information. Your husband has had months to prepare. We need to catch up quickly. Financial records, property information, communications, anything that might indicate how long he's been planning this and what steps he's already taken." "I have the screenshots of what I found," I offered. "That's a start. But we'll need more." "Much more." She pulled a folder from her desk drawer and slid it across to me. "This contains a comprehensive checklist of documents we'll need. Financial statements, tax returns, property deeds, investment accounts, retirement funds, everything. I stared at the folder, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task ahead. This wasn't just a divorce, it was financial warfare. "When do you expect your husband to return from his trip?" Catherine asked. "Thursday evening." "Good. That gives us 3 days to prepare. I suggest you use this time to gather as much information as possible without alerting him to what you know." She leaned forward, her expression intensifying. "Olivia, I need to ask you something important. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with a divorce? Once we file paperwork, there's no easy way to undo this process." The question caught me off guard. Was I certain? Just yesterday morning, I had been a happily married woman sorting through my grandmother's keepsakes. Now I was sitting in a divorce attorney's office planning my exit strategy. But then I remembered the calculated phrases in Ryan's email, the careful timing of his attention, the years of struggling to support us while he was secretly planning his escape once the money arrived. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than before. "I'm certain." Catherine nodded, satisfied. "Then we'll move quickly. I'll have my team start preparing the necessary paperwork today. In the meantime, I want you to go home and act as normally as possible. Continue your text exchanges with your husband. Don't give him any reason to suspect that you know." As I gathered my purse to leave, Catherine added one final piece of advice. "Olivia, the next few weeks will be among the most difficult of your life. Your home, your routines, your memories, everything will feel different now. That's normal. But remember, you're not alone in this process." On the drive home, her words echoed in my mind. Everything will feel different now. She was right, as I pulled into our driveway, the house before me, the craftsman-style home Ryan and I had purchased 4 years ago with such hope and excitement, seemed like a stranger's property. The blue front door we had painted together during our first summer here, the garden beds where I had spent countless weekend hours planting perennials, the porch swing where we had shared wine and dreams on warm evenings, all of it looked like props on a stage where a play I no longer wanted to be part of was being performed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately hit by the scent that was uniquely ours, a blend of the sandalwood candles I loved, the coffee Ryan brewed every morning, and the faint hint of the lemon polish I used on our hardwood floors. For a moment, the familiarity of it threatened to undo me. I set my purse down on the entryway table, noticing the framed photo of Ryan and me from our anniversary trip to Napa Valley last year. His arm was around my shoulder, both of us smiling broadly against a backdrop of vineyards. Had he already been planning his exit strategy then? Had he already consulted with divorce attorneys about the most advantageous time to leave me? Moving through the house felt like walking through a museum of broken promises. The kitchen where we had cooked, Sunday brunches together, the living room where we had hosted game nights with friends, the office where we had sat side by side, planning our financial future, a future Ryan had never intended to share. Even the mundane objects seemed charged with new meaning. The expensive coffee maker Ryan had insisted we needed, the smart home system he had installed last winter, the renovation plans for the master bathroom sitting on his desk. Had these all been investments in a home he was planning to claim in the divorce? I made my way to our bedroom, pausing at the threshold. The king-sized bed with its slate blue comforter looked vast and empty now. How many nights had I lain there, thinking we were building a life together, while beside me, Ryan had been calculating his departure? Opening the closet, I stared at Ryan's neatly arranged shirts hanging beside my dresses. The physical proximity of our clothes seemed like a mockery now, an illusion of unity that had masked the growing distance between us. My phone chimed with a text notification. Ryan again. "Ryan, just finished another meeting, going better than expected. How's your day going?" I stared at the message, hearing Catherine Bradford's advice in my head. Act as normally as possible. Me. Pretty good. Just got back from running. some errands. Working on organizing Grandma's things this afternoon. The partial truth felt bitter on my tongue. This strange limbo, knowing what I knew while pretending I didn't, was its own kind of torture. I set the phone down and moved to the window, looking out at the backyard where we had once talked about building a play structure for the children we hoped to have. The future we had planned together had vanished overnight, replaced by a battlefield of legal strategies and asset divisions. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same. My environment hadn't changed. My understanding of it had. And there was no going back. By evening, the initial shock had settled into something colder and more focused. I sat at our dining room table, Catherine Bradford's folder open before me, systematically working through her checklist of documents. Tax returns for the past 5 years, located and copied. Bank statements, downloaded and saved. Investment account, information, compiled and organized. Property documents, found and duplicated. As I worked, a pattern began to emerge, one that made my stomach twist with each new discovery. Over the past year, Ryan had been systematically moving small amounts of money from our joint savings account into his personal account. Nothing large enough to trigger my concern at the time, but cumulatively significant. Almost $47,000 had disappeared. Additionally, his struggling construction business suddenly showed recent investments in new equipment and a lease on a larger workspace, despite Ryan telling me they were barely breaking even. Where had that money come from? And why make those investments if the business was failing? The more I dug, the more questions emerged. Ryan had also recently updated his life insurance policy, removing me as the primary beneficiary and replacing me with his sister Claire. He had opened a new credit card I knew nothing about. He had even consulted with a real estate agent about investment properties without mentioning it to me. These weren't the actions of a husband planning a shared future. These were the calculated moves of someone preparing an exit strategy. Someone who had already emotionally and financially divorced me long before I knew our marriage was over. My phone rang, startling me from my research. Ryan's face flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but Catherine's advice echoed in my mind. Act normally. I took a deep breath, carefully moved the financial documents out of sight, and answered with the most neutral tone I could manage. "Hey, how's the trip going?" I asked, surprised by how ordinary my voice sounded. "Great. Really great," Ryan replied, his voice carrying that enthusiastic tone he reserved for when he was particularly pleased with himself. "Just finished dinner with the clients. I think we've got this contract in the bag." "That's wonderful," I said, wondering if there were any clients at all or if this entire trip was part of his scheme. "What kind of project is it?" "Mixed use. Development downtown. Potential for multiple phases if the first one goes well. Could be worth millions over the next few years." Millions. The word hung between us. Was he already planning how to use my inheritance to fund this supposed project? Or was this just another fabrication designed to explain a sudden influx of cash when he thought he'd get half of my grandmother's money? "Sounds exciting," I managed. "When will you know for sure?" "Should have the preliminary agreement before I fly back Thursday. Speaking of which," his voice shifted to a softer tone. "Any news on your grandmother's estate? You mentioned it might be finalized soon." There it was, the real reason for his call. Not to check in on me, not because he missed his wife, but to fish for information about the money. "The lawyer called today, actually," I said, the lie coming easier than I expected. "They're still processing some paperwork, but it should be settled within the next week or two." "That's great," Ryan said, a new eagerness entering his voice. "Did they give you any indication of the amount? I know your grandmother was pretty private about her finances." I gripped the phone tighter, fighting back the wave of disgust threatening to choke me. "They mentioned a figure, but said it wasn't final yet. I'd rather wait until everything's official before getting our hopes up." Of course, he replied quickly. No rush. We've got plenty of time to figure out what to do with it. Maybe we could put some toward that kitchen renovation you've been wanting. Or maybe a vacation. We haven't had a real getaway in years. The casual way he included himself in my inheritance, what to do with it. We could put some toward, confirmed everything. In his mind, my grandmother's money was already partly his. A vacation sounds nice, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. We'll talk about it when you get back. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, I ended the call with a practiced love you that felt like ashes in my mouth. As soon as Ryan's face disappeared from my screen, I set the phone down with trembling hands. The evidence was overwhelming. The husband I thought I knew, the man I had supported emotionally and financially for years, had been plotting behind my back, waiting for the perfect moment to take advantage of my grandmother's death. I returned to the dining table and stared at the scattered documents, each one another nail in the coffin of my marriage. I had spent the day gathering information, confirming what I already suspected. Now it was time to move beyond information to action. I picked up my phone again and texted Catherine Bradford. Me, I've gathered most of the documents on your list. Found evidence of hidden money transfers and suspicious business investments. When can we meet again? Her response came quickly. Catherine, tomorrow, 8 a.m. Bring everything you've found. And Olivia, make sure your husband has no idea you're doing this. Me, he won't. I spent the next hour organizing everything I'd discovered into clear chronological files. The pattern of deception, laid out in black and white, was undeniable. Ryan had been methodically preparing for this moment for at least a year, probably longer. As midnight approached, I finally closed the last folder and leaned back in my chair, exhaustion washing over me. The emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours, from oblivious wife to betrayed spouse to strategic opponent, had drained me completely. Yet despite the exhaustion, my mind remained sharp, focused in a way it hadn't been in years. The white fog of trust and complacency had lifted, revealing a clarity I had forgotten was possible. For so long, I had defined myself in relation to Ryan, his wife, his supporter, his partner. Now, faced with his betrayal, I was rediscovering the woman I had been before him, determined, resourceful, and unwilling to be anyone's victim. I gathered the folders and locked them in my grandmother's antique writing desk, the one piece of ghee. Furniture Ryan had always disliked, and thus would never think to search. Then I went through the house, carefully returning everything to its proper place, erasing all evidence of my investigation. In our bedroom, I changed into my nightgown and slipped between the cold sheets of our bed, staring up at the ceiling. Tomorrow would mark a turning point. Tomorrow I would officially set in motion the end of my marriage. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of purpose. Ryan had been planning his strategy for months, believing he held all the cards, confident in my ignorance and trust. He had no idea that the game had changed, that I was now playing by different rules entirely. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. Ryan would not get a single penny of my inheritance. Not 1 cent. Whatever it took, whatever I had to do, I would make sure of that. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I smiled in the darkness. Ryan thought he was so clever, so strategic. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me, and that would be his downfall. The next morning, I arrived at Catherine Bradford's office 15 minutes early, my grandmother's leather portfolio bulging with the evidence I'd collected. The receptionist showed me directly to a conference room where Catherine was already waiting, a cup of coffee in hand. "You look like you could use this," she said, pushing a second cup toward me. "Long night?" "Very," I confirmed, gratefully accepting the coffee. "But productive." I opened the portfolio and began spreading documents across the polished conference table. Bank statements showing systematic withdrawals from our joint account over the past 14 months. Business investments Ryan never mentioned to me. A new credit card opened 6 months ago that I never knew about. The life insurance policy change removing me as beneficiary. And property inquiries he's been making without my knowledge. Catherine nodded, examining each document with methodical precision. "This is good," she said after several minutes. "Very good. He's been careful, but not careful enough." She paused at the life insurance document, her eyebrow raising slightly. "This is particularly interesting. Changing beneficiaries immediately before filing for divorce can sometimes be contested as anticipatory dissipation of marital assets. It suggests he's been planning this for some time?" "He has," I confirmed, pulling out the screenshots of the legal consultation receipt and draft email. "These are from 3 months ago, right after my grandmother passed away." Catherine studied them, her expression hardening. "Whitman and Associates," she murmured. "I know them. Gordon Whitman specializes in high-asset divorces, representing primarily male clients. He has a reputation for aggressive tactics." A chill ran through me. "What kind of tactics?" Catherine set the papers down, fixing me with a steady gaze. "Olivia, I need to prepare you for what might be coming. Based on what you've shown me and what I know of Whitman's approach, your husband appears to be setting up a particular type of divorce strategy." She tapped the document spread before us. "The secret financial movements, the business investments, the life insurance change. These suggest he's creating what we call a controlled dissolution scenario. He's positioning assets where he believes they'll be either inaccessible to you or classified differently in divorce proceedings." "And my inheritance?" I asked, my throat tight. "That's likely the centerpiece of his strategy," Catherine confirmed. "In most states, inheritances are considered separate property, not subject to division in divorce, unless they're commingled with marital assets." "Commingled?" "Mixed together. For instance, if you deposited your inheritance into a joint account, or used it to pay off a joint debt, or invested it in jointly owned property, it could lose its protected status as separate property. Some or all of it could be considered marital property, subject to division." Understanding dawned, cold and clear. "That's why he's been suggesting joint investments and renovations on our house. That's why he wanted me to merge my accounts with his." Catherine nodded grimly. "Exactly. If he could get you to commingle your inheritance with marital assets, he could potentially claim a portion of it in the divorce." The revelation struck me with physical force. It wasn't just opportunistic. Divorce timing. It was a calculated financial strategy designed to capture as much of my inheritance as possible. "There's something else you should know," Catherine continued, her voice gentler now. "This type of planning typically doesn't happen in isolation. There's usually a triggering event or a longer history that precedes it." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that people don't generally wake up one day and decide to defraud their spouse. There's often a pattern of dishonesty that builds over time." She hesitated, then continued carefully. "Olivia, have you looked into your husband's business finances more deeply? The timing of his consultations with Whitman, the secret financial movements, they suggest a level of calculation that's concerning." I shook my head slowly. "I've been so focused on our personal accounts and the inheritance that I haven't really dug into his business records. He always handled that separately." Catherine reached for her phone. "With your permission, I'd like to bring in a forensic accountant, someone who specializes in examining business finances for divorce proceedings." Within 30 minutes, a sharp-eyed woman named Elaine Phillips had joined us, her laptop open as she examined the business documents I had brought. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she cross-referenced information. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said finally, looking up at me, "when did you say your husband's construction business began struggling?" "About 2 years ago," I replied. "At least that's what Ryan told me. He said projects were falling through, clients weren't paying on time, and expenses were eating into profits." Elaine turned her laptop toward me. That's not consistent with what I'm seeing here. According to these tax filings and bank statements, Mitchell Construction has maintained steady profitability for the past 3 years. In fact, revenues have increased by approximately 15% year over year. I stared at the screen, trying to process this information. That can't be right. We've been living almost entirely on my teacher's salary for the past 2 years. Ryan said the business was barely breaking even. The business appears to be doing quite well, Elaine countered, scrolling through more documents. What's interesting is the pattern of withdrawals and deposits I'm seeing. Large sums moving through the business account, then being transferred to personal accounts but not your joint accounts. My hands gripped the edge of the table. What are you saying? Elaine and Catherine exchanged glances before Catherine spoke. Olivia, based on what we're seeing, it appears your husband may have been hiding income and assets for quite some time. The business struggles he described to you don't align with the financial records. He lied about the business, I whispered, the full implications sinking in. He told me we were struggling financially while his company was actually profitable. More than that, Elaine added gently. He appears to have been diverting business profits to accounts you don't have access to, accounts that wouldn't be immediately obvious in divorce proceedings without careful forensic investigation. The room seemed to tilt around me. 2 years of careful budgeting, of stretching my teacher's salary to cover our mortgage and bills, of postponing home repairs and personal expenses because the business was struggling. All of it had been unnecessary. All of it had been a lie. Why? I asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Why maintain this fiction of financial struggle? Catherine's answer was calm but direct. Control and preparation. By convincing you that money was tight, he could control household spending and your financial decisions. By diverting business profits to hidden accounts, he could build a financial safety net you knew nothing about. And when your grandmother's inheritance finally came through, he would be positioned to take as much of it as possible while keeping his own assets hidden. I finished, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. This wasn't a spontaneous decision triggered by your inheritance. This appears to be the culmination of a long-term financial strategy. I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of the deception. It wasn't just about the divorce or the inheritance. It was about years of calculated lies, of financial manipulation, of a husband systematically preparing to abandon his wife while maximizing his financial gain. What do we do now? I asked finally, my voice steadier than I expected. Catherine closed the folder in front of her with a decisive motion. Now, we change the game entirely. Your husband thinks he's been clever, hiding assets and planning the perfect moment to file for divorce. He's expecting you to be caught off guard, unaware of his financial maneuvering. A small, determined smile curved her lips. Instead, we're going to be the ones to file first, and we're going to do it with full knowledge of what he's been hiding. For the first time since discovering Ryan's betrayal, I felt something beyond anger and hurt. I felt a surge of righteous determination, a clarity of purpose that cut through the emotional fog. When? I asked. Immediately, Catherine replied. Today, before he returns from his trip. And Olivia, she leaned forward, her expression intense. When this is over, he won't get a penny of your inheritance. In fact, given what we've discovered about his hidden assets, he'll be the one paying you. As I left Catherine's office, 2 hours later, the divorce papers had already been prepared, ready to be filed with the court that afternoon. But more was in motion than just the legal proceedings. Catherine had arranged for a forensic analysis of all of Ryan's business accounts. She had filed emergency motions to freeze certain assets pending further investigation. And she had scheduled a deposition with Ryan's attorney at Whitman & Associates for the day after Ryan's return. The trap was set, and Ryan had no idea it was waiting for him. That afternoon, Catherine's office became command central for what she called Operation Checkmate. The conference room walls were now covered with timelines, financial charts, and legal strategies. Catherine had assembled a small but formidable team. Elaine Phillips, the forensic accountant, Marcus Webb, a specialist in hidden asset recovery, and Sophia Chen, a junior attorney with a background in financial crimes prosecution. "The divorce papers have been filed," Catherine announced as she returned to the conference room. "Ryan will be served when he returns tomorrow evening." She turned to me. "Olivia, we need to discuss your immediate next steps. Once Ryan is served, things will move quickly. He'll be angry, confused, and most importantly, he'll try to damage control. We need to be prepared for every possible reaction." I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. The adrenaline of discovery and action had sustained me so far, but the reality of what was coming, confronting the man I had loved and trusted for 6 years, was beginning to sink in. "What exactly should I expect?" I asked. Catherine gestured to Sophia, who opened a folder labeled Respondent Reaction Patterns. "Based on similar cases," Sophia explained, "there are typically 4 response categories when someone is caught off guard by divorce proceedings, especially when financial deception is involved." She flipped to a chart and pointed to the first section. Denial. He'll claim there's been a misunderstanding, that the business difficulties were real, that any separate accounts were for legitimate purposes. Her finger moved to the second section. Deflection. He'll try to shift blame, perhaps suggesting you've been distant or unsupportive, or that you're overreacting to normal business practices. The third section was labeled Damage Control. This is where he'll try to quickly move or hide any assets we haven't yet identified. He may attempt to access joint accounts, pressure mutual friends for information, or even try to manipulate you emotionally to slow the proceedings. Finally, she pointed to desperation. If the other approaches fail, he may become unpredictable. Some people make threats, some make sudden conciliatory gestures, and some simply try to disappear with whatever assets they can gather. I tried to imagine Ryan's face when he was served the divorce papers. Which Ryan would respond? The charming, confident man I fell in love with, or the calculating deceiver I had discovered him to be? "Given what we know about your husband's methodical planning," Catherine interjected, "I suspect he'll move quickly from denial to damage control. He won't waste time with emotional appeals once he realizes you have evidence of his financial maneuvers." Marcus, the asset recovery specialist, spoke up. "That's why we've already filed motions to freeze the accounts we've identified, but there may be others we haven't found yet." "Which brings us to your role, Olivia," Catherine said, her expression serious. "Between now and when Ryan returns, we need you to do 3 critical things." She held up one finger. "First, secure your inheritance. I've arranged for you to meet with a trust attorney this evening who will help you place those funds in a protected, separate trust that clearly establishes them as non-marital property." A second finger joined the first. "Second, secure your personal belongings and important documents. Anything of significant monetary or sentimental value should be removed from your home and stored elsewhere, family, friends, or a safe deposit box." Her third finger completed the count. "Finally, prepare for temporary separation. Pack enough clothes and necessities for at least 2 weeks. Once Ryan is served, I strongly advise against remaining in the same household." The last instruction hit me hardest. Despite everything I had learned, despite the betrayal and manipulation, the thought of physically leaving our home made this all suddenly, painfully real. "Where will I go?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "Do you have family nearby?" Catherine asked. I shook my head. "My parents retired to Arizona last year. My closest friend, Melissa, lives about an hour away." "That might be perfect," Catherine nodded. "Far enough to create a buffer, close enough to maintain your normal work routine." Would she be willing to host you temporarily? I thought of Melissa, my college roommate and steadfast friend who had never particularly warmed to Ryan. Yes, she would. Good. Contact her today, but be discreet. No details over the phone or in texts. Simply ask if you can visit for a while. The meeting continued with more specific instructions. I was to withdraw a reasonable amount of cash from my personal account for immediate expenses. I was to inventory household items of value. I was to change passwords on all my personal accounts and create an entirely new email address for communications with Catherine's team. As the strategy session wound down, Elaine approached me with her laptop. Olivia, there's something else you should see. She turned the screen toward me, displaying a bank statement I didn't recognize. This is from an account in the Cayman Islands, she explained. It was referenced obliquely in some of the business documents you provided. We'll need court orders to get full details, but the transfer patterns suggest it's where a significant portion of Mitchell Construction's profits have been diverted. I stared at the partial information visible on the screen, the dates of deposits corresponding with periods when Ryan had told me his business was struggling most severely. How much? I asked, my voice tight. Elaine hesitated. Based on the transfers, we can trace, conservatively, over $800,000. The room seemed to tilt around me. $800,000. Hidden, stolen, essentially, from our marriage. All while I had been carefully budgeting my teacher's salary, postponing home repairs, giving up small luxuries to help us get through the rough patch. Olivia? Catherine's voice cut through my shock. Are you all right? I took a deep breath. Then another. The hurt and betrayal were still there, a physical ache in my chest. But now they were joined by something else. Cold, clear anger. I'm fine, I said, straightening my shoulders. What's our next move? Catherine studied me for a moment, then nodded with approval. Now we prepare for the deposition. Ryan and his attorney will be expecting a routine initial meeting, perhaps even an opportunity to intimidate you with their demands. They have no idea what's coming. She closed her folder with a decisive snap. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., we'll finalize everything. By this time tomorrow, your husband and his lawyer will understand exactly what they're up against. As I left Catherine's office, my mind was spinning with action items and strategies. But one thought remained crystal clear above the chaos. Ryan had spent years underestimating me, treating me as a pawn in his financial chess game. Tomorrow, he would discover just how badly he had miscalculated. The trust attorney Catherine had arranged for me to meet was a silver-haired woman named Judith Winters, whose office was in the same building but 3 floors down. Within an hour, she had established an irrevocable trust for my grandmother's inheritance, with ironclad documentation of its premarital source and separation from any joint assets. This creates a legal firewall between your inheritance and any claims your husband might make, Judith explained as I signed the final documents. Even the most aggressive divorce attorney would have difficulty penetrating this structure. Next came the practical preparations. I drove home with a mental checklist running through my mind. Pack essentials, secure valuables, inventory the house. My phone chimed with a text from Ryan as I pulled into our driveway. Ryan. Wrapped up meetings. Early. Taking an earlier flight home tomorrow morning instead of evening. Can't wait to see you. My heart rate spiked. This changed everything. Catherine's carefully orchestrated plan had assumed we had until tomorrow evening before Ryan returned. Now, he would be home hours earlier, cutting short our preparation time. I immediately called Catherine. He's coming back tomorrow morning, I said without preamble when she answered. What do we do? There was a brief pause before she responded, her voice calm but decisive. This actually works in our favor. The process server will meet him at the airport instead of at your home. You'll have time to pack and leave while he's dealing with the initial shock. Where are you now? Just got home. Good. Start packing immediately. Take only what you absolutely need for the next few weeks. Focus on important documents, irreplaceable items, and necessities. Have you contacted your friend about staying with her? Yes, Melissa's expecting me tomorrow. Go tonight instead. The sooner you're out of the house, the better. After hanging up, I moved through our home with singular focus, gathering essential documents, jewelry, and family heirlooms. I packed 2 suitcases with clothes and personal items, struggling to decide what I truly needed from the life I was leaving behind in our home office. I hesitated before Ryan's desk. Catherine had emphasized the importance of finding any additional financial documentation that might help our case. I knew Ryan kept some papers in his desk drawer, papers he never wanted me to see. It was locked, of course. But I remembered seeing him retrieve a key from behind the credenza last Christmas when he needed to access some tax documents. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached behind the heavy piece of furniture, feeling along the back edge until they connected with cold metal. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing several folders and a stack of mail. I quickly photographed everything before examining it more closely. Most were routine business documents, but one folder labeled Personal Investments caught my attention. Inside were statements for 3 accounts I'd never seen before, investment accounts in Ryan's name only, collectively holding nearly $300,000. The most recent statement showed a substantial withdrawal 2 months ago, with a notation: property deposit, Lakeview. Lakeview? I frowned, trying to remember if Ryan had ever mentioned property in an area called Lakeview. Nothing came to mind. I photographed each statement carefully, then returned everything exactly as I had found it, locking the drawer and replacing the key. My phone rang as I was zipping up my second suitcase. Melissa. Hey, I'm just checking in. Her voice was concerned. You sounded weird on the phone earlier. Is everything okay? I glanced around our bedroom, at the half-empty closet, the packed suitcases, the bare nightstand where my books and reading glasses usually sat. No, I admitted quietly. Nothing's okay, but I can't explain over the phone. I'll be at your place in about 2 hours. I'll tell you everything then. Olivia, you're scaring me. Are you safe? Is it Ryan? Do you need me to call someone? I'm safe, I assured her. And I'm handling it, I promise. I just need a place to stay for a while. After hanging up, I did one final sweep of the house, making sure I hadn't missed anything critical. In the kitchen, I hesitated, then scribbled a brief note on the whiteboard we used for grocery lists. Had to go to Melissa's. Family emergency. We'll call. It wasn't much of a cover story, but it might buy me a few hours if Ryan somehow made it home before being served with the divorce papers. I loaded the car methodically, placing the most important items, documents, family heirlooms, irreplaceable photographs, in the trunk, hidden under a blanket. As I was about to pull out of the driveway, a car I didn't recognize slowed in front of our house. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be Ryan, somehow already back from his trip. Instead, a middle-aged woman emerged and approached my car. I lowered the window cautiously. Olivia Mitchell? She asked. I nodded, tense and ready to drive away if necessary. I'm Diana West, she said, holding out a business card. Catherine Bradford sent me. I'm a private investigator specializing in asset searches. I exhaled with relief, taking the card. She didn't mention you'd be coming to the house. Last-minute decision after you called about your husband's early return, Diana explained. I need to do a quick sweep of the property while you're still here to legally grant me access. We're looking for any additional financial evidence or hidden valuables before you leave. For the next 45 minutes, Diana moved methodically through our home, photographing documents, examining hiding spots I would never have thought to check, and occasionally asking me questions about Ryan's habits and behaviors. In Ryan's closet, she knelt and carefully examined the floorboards, then smiled triumphantly as one lifted to reveal a small recess containing a fireproof document box. This is common, she explained at my shocked expression. Men like your husband often keep their most sensitive documents in hiding spots they think are clever. The locked box yielded to Diana's expertise within minutes. Inside were several USB drives, a passport I didn't know Ryan had, and a small notebook filled with account numbers, passwords, and what appeared to be property addresses. "Jackpot," Diana murmured, photographing each page of the notebook. "Ms. Bradford will want to see all of this immediately." She handed me one of the USB drives. "Take this with you. The rest I'll bring directly to Catherine's office. There could be critical information here that will strengthen your case substantially." As Diana prepared to leave, she paused, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've seen hundreds of cases like yours. Spouses hiding assets, planning secret exits, trying to manipulate the system." She placed a hand briefly on my arm. "The fact that you discovered this before he could implement his plan puts you in an extraordinarily advantageous position. Most aren't so fortunate." After Diana left, I sat in my car for several long minutes, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 36 hours. My marriage was over. My husband was a stranger, a calculating, deceptive stranger who had been planning to betray me for months, possibly years. Yet despite the pain and shock, I felt strangely empowered. I had discovered the truth. I was taking action. I was no longer the oblivious wife, the unwitting mark in Ryan's financial scheme. I started the car and backed out of the driveway of the home Ryan and I had shared, uncertain if I would ever return. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind me. It looked exactly as it always had: the blue door, the carefully tended garden beds, the porch swing gently moving in the evening breeze. But I was different, and tomorrow, when Ryan stepped off that plane, his world would be different too. I plugged Melissa's address into my GPS and headed toward my temporary refuge, the USB drive from Ryan's secret lockbox burning a hole in my pocket. Whatever information it contained might be the final piece of the puzzle, the definitive evidence of his betrayal and deceit. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Melissa's guest room became my war room that night. After explaining everything to my stunned friend, who alternated between offering comforting hugs and suggesting increasingly creative ways to destroy Ryan's life, I connected the USB drive to my laptop. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. The drive contained meticulously organized folders: property investments, offshore accounts, divorce strategy, and most damning of all, Olivia's inheritance. I opened the last folder with trembling fingers, finding a detailed analysis of my grandmother's estate that Ryan had somehow obtained, complete with estimated values and liquidation timelines. There was also a document titled Access Strategy that outlined, in Ryan's own words, his plan to convince me to commingle the inheritance with our marital assets. The document included specific talking points he planned to use: emphasize joint dreams, home renovation, travel, eventual retirement property, position as our future rather than your money. Suggest practical financial benefits of consolidation, better. Investment returns, tax advantages, simplified management. If resistance encountered, introduce subtle guilt. I thought we were building a life together, or don't you trust me with our future? Reading his calculated manipulation strategy, seeing how he planned to exploit my trust and our shared dreams, was like being stabbed repeatedly. This wasn't opportunistic, it was predatory. He had studied me, identified my emotional triggers, and planned to use them against me to gain access to my inheritance. "That calculating bastard," Melissa murmured, reading over my shoulder. "Liv, I never liked him, but this is sociopathic." I nodded numbly, opening the divorce strategy folder next. Inside was a timeline that made my blood run cold. Secure access to inheritance funds, estimated window 1-2 months post-disbursement. Transfer accessible funds to preparation accounts within 72 hours of access. File divorce paperwork through Whitman immediately following transfers. Implement business protection protocol to obscure remaining assets. He had planned it all, down to the day he would file for divorce after getting his hands on my money. The cold precision of it was almost impressive in its villainy. I immediately forwarded everything to Catherine's secure email address, then called her despite the late hour. "Catherine, it's Olivia. I'm looking at files from Ryan's hidden USB drive. You need to see this immediately." "I'm already reviewing what Diana brought over," she replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This is extraordinary evidence, Olivia. The explicit documentation of intent to defraud is something we rarely see. What does this mean for tomorrow? It means we've moved beyond a standard divorce case. This is now potentially criminal. Financial fraud, wire fraud if he used electronic, means for some of these transfers, possibly tax evasion given what we're seeing in the offshore materials." She paused and I could hear papers shuffling. "I'm bringing in additional counsel with criminal law expertise first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, have you reviewed the property files? There appears to be a lakefront home purchased 3 months ago that wasn't disclosed in any of the financial documents you provided earlier." I quickly opened the property folder, finding purchase documents for a $1.2 million vacation home on Lake Geneva, about 2 hours from our city. The down payment had come from one of Ryan's hidden accounts, with a mortgage in the name of an LLC I'd never heard of. "He bought a lake house," I whispered, the betrayal deepening with each new discovery. "A vacation home he never mentioned." "It appears to be part of his exit strategy," Catherine observed. "Assets hidden in corporate entities, a comfortable retreat already secured. He's been planning this exit for quite some time." After reviewing more files with Catherine, I finally collapsed into Melissa's guest bed around 2 a.m., exhausted but unable to sleep. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Ryan, landing at 10:45 a.m. tomorrow. Can't wait to see you. Been thinking about our future the whole trip. So many exciting possibilities ahead for us." The casual deception, the continued performance of the loving husband even as he prepared to steal from me and disappear, made my stomach turn. I didn't reply. Morning came too quickly. I showered and dressed with particular care, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected confidence and authority. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day Ryan's carefully constructed house of cards would collapse. I arrived at Catherine's office at 9 a.m. sharp, finding her team already assembled and augmented by 2 new faces. A distinguished older man introduced as James Harrington, a former federal prosecutor now specializing in financial crimes, and a younger woman named Rebecca Diaz, an attorney with expertise in international asset recovery. "The process server has confirmed his position at the airport," Catherine announced as we gathered in the conference room. "Ryan's flight is on time, scheduled to land in approximately 2 hours. He'll be served immediately upon exiting the secure area." She turned to me. "Olivia, the deposition with Whitman and Associates is scheduled for 2 p.m. Based on standard response patterns, we expect Ryan to contact his attorney immediately after being served. Whitman will likely advise him to proceed with the deposition despite the surprise, believing they can still control the narrative." "And they can't?" I asked. James Harrington smiled thinly. "Not even close. The evidence you've provided gives us extraordinary leverage. What was initially a divorce case has evolved into potential criminal exposure for both your husband and possibly his attorney, if Whitman was knowingly participating in the fraudulent asset concealment. This is what will happen," Catherine continued, laying out a folder containing what appeared to be a script. "The deposition will begin normally. Gordon Whitman will likely try to establish a dominant position immediately, laying out demands based on their original strategy, which assumed you knew nothing about the hidden assets or their divorce planning." Rebecca picked up the thread. We'll allow them to present their initial position without challenge. This accomplishes two things: creates a record of their demands, which will demonstrate bad faith negotiation when contrasted with the evidence, and gives them enough rope to hang themselves by explicitly stating positions that the evidence directly contradicts. And then? I asked. Catherine's expression was coolly satisfied. And then we spring the trap. We'll introduce the evidence methodically, beginning with the documentation of hidden business profits, followed by the offshore accounts, the secret property purchases, and finally, the inheritance plan, I finished. Exactly. By the time we're done, Whitman will be in damage control mode, and your husband will be facing not just divorce but potential criminal charges. The next 2 hours were spent meticulously rehearsing the deposition strategy. I was to remain calm and composed regardless of what accusations or claims Ryan might make. I was to defer to Catherine for all responses. I was to maintain eye contact with both Ryan and his attorney throughout, never showing weakness or uncertainty. At 11:30 a.m., Catherine's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up at me. The papers have been served. Ryan Mitchell is now officially on notice that you are filing for divorce. A strange calm settled over me. There was no going back now. The confrontation I had been preparing for was just hours away. How do you think he'll react? I asked quietly. Catherine considered for a moment. Based on the personality profile we've established from your descriptions and his documented behaviors, I expect controlled anger initially. Men like your husband, calculated, strategic, accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, typically respond to unexpected challenges. With an attempt to reassert control, she touched my arm lightly. He will try to make you doubt yourself, Olivia. He'll attempt to reframe the narrative, to make you question what you've discovered or your interpretation of it. This is a manipulation tactic, and it's critical that you recognize it for what it is. I nodded, steeling myself. I'm ready. One last thing, Catherine said, handing me a small object that looked like a decorative pin. This is a legal recording device. We'll have the official stenographer for the deposition, of course, but this ensures we capture everything, including any conversations before the formal proceedings begin. As the clock ticked closer to 2 p.m., I felt a strange transformation happening within me. The hurt, betrayed wife was receding, replaced by a woman I barely recognized, someone stronger, colder, more determined than I had ever been. Ryan had spent years underestimating me, treating me as an accessory to his life rather than a full partner, assuming I would never discover his betrayal or have the strength to fight back. Today he would learn just how wrong he had been. It's time, Catherine announced, gathering her materials. Let's go introduce your husband to the consequences of his actions. The conference room at Whitman & Associates exuded calculated intimidation. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and a massive table that positioned Gordon Whitman at the symbolic head, with Ryan at his right hand. Catherine had prepared me for this exact setup, the power positioning, the psychological tactics built into the very architecture of the space. Remember, Catherine murmured as we waited in the reception area. They believe they're in control. Let them keep believing that until the moment we choose to shatter the illusion. When the receptionist finally led us into the conference room, I saw Ryan for the first time since discovering his betrayal. He looked exactly as he always did: crisp blue shirt, confident posture, the practiced smile that had once made my heart skip. Now, seeing through the facade to the calculation beneath, that smile sent a chill down my spine. His expression flickered briefly when he saw me. Surprise, quickly masked by the smooth confidence he wore like armor. He had expected me to arrive. Emotional, perhaps tearful, or angry. My composed demeanor and professional attire had caught him off guard. "Olivia," he said, standing and moving as if to embrace me. Catherine subtly positioned herself between us. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Catherine Bradford, representing Mrs. Mitchell in these proceedings. I believe we should keep this professional. Ryan's smile tightened a fraction. Of course, I was just surprised by all this. There's clearly been some misunderstanding. Gordon Whitman, a silver-haired man with cold eyes and an expensive suit, gestured to the chairs opposite them. Please sit. I think we can resolve this matter efficiently if we all maintain a reasonable perspective. Catherine and I took our seats, arranged our materials with deliberate care, and waited as the stenographer set up her equipment in the corner. Before we begin officially, Whitman continued, his tone condescendingly patient, I want to express that we were surprised by the filing. Ryan has made it clear that there have been no discussions of divorce between you prior to this rather impulsive action. Catherine smiled pleasantly. We'll address timing and motivation shortly, Mr. Whitman. Shall we proceed with the formal deposition? Whitman nodded, clearly believing he was humoring us before steering the conversation back to his agenda. The stenographer indicated she was ready, and the deposition officially began. For the record, Whitman stated, my client, Ryan Mitchell, has been blindsided by this divorce filing and categorically denies any wrongdoing or grounds for dissolution of the marriage beyond irreconcilable differences. He shuffled some papers importantly. Nevertheless, in the interest of an amicable resolution, we are prepared to offer a standard division of marital assets acquired during the 6-year marriage, with the following stipulations. What followed was precisely what Catherine had predicted. Proposal that positioned Ryan as generously allowing me to keep my personal possessions and a fair portion of our visible marital assets, while making specific claims to portions of any inheritances received during the marriage, citing his contributions to the marriage and support during the bereavement period. Throughout Whitman's presentation, Ryan maintained an expression of reasonable concern, occasionally nodding at points or offering sympathetic glances in my direction, the performance of a husband reluctantly accepting the end of his marriage, while trying to be fair. When Whitman finished outlining their proposal, he leaned back, the picture of a man who believed he had just laid out an eminently reasonable position that any sensible person would accept. Now, he concluded, in the interest of efficiency, we've prepared a preliminary settlement agreement along these lines. If Mrs. Mitchell is amenable to these general terms, we could potentially resolve this matter today without prolonged legal proceedings. Catherine thanked him politely, then turned to me. Olivia, do you have any questions about the proposal before we respond? This was the moment we had rehearsed, my only direct engagement before Catherine took over. I looked directly at Ryan, meeting his eyes without flinching. Just one, I said, my voice steady and clear. When exactly were you planning to file for divorce, Ryan? Before or after you transferred my inheritance to your hidden accounts? The blood drained from Ryan's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Beside him, Whitman stiffened, his expression shifting from confident control to wary assessment in an instant. I don't know what you're talking about, Ryan managed, but his voice had lost its smooth assurance. Mrs. Mitchell is referring to Exhibit A in our counterfiling, Catherine said calmly, sliding a document across the table. A detailed timeline recovered from Mr. Mitchell's personal files, outlining his plan to divorce my client immediately after gaining access to her inheritance. Whitman scanned the document, his expression hardening as he realized the situation had just dramatically shifted. Where did you obtain this? He demanded. From a USB drive Mr. Mitchell kept hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of his closet, Catherine replied. Along with quite a collection of other interesting documents, she began methodically laying out file folders, each labeled with evidence categories. Financial records documenting systematic diversion of business profits to hidden accounts, contrary to Mr. Mitchell's representations to his wife about the company's financial status. Documentation of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, holding approximately $800,000 in concealed assets. Purchase records for a $1.2 million lake house bought through a shell company 3 months ago, never disclosed to Mrs. Mitchell. With each new folder, Ryan seemed to physically shrink, his confident facade crumbling. Whitman's expression shifted from shock to calculation to grim recognition that he was now in damage control mode. And perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, Catherine continued, placing the final folder on the table. Detailed plans for accessing and transferring Mrs. Mitchell's inheritance, including scripted conversations designed to manipulate her into commingling those funds with marital assets before filing for divorce. The room went completely silent. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering above her machine as she processed what she was transcribing. Ryan suddenly found his voice. "Olivia, this isn't— you don't understand." "Mr. Mitchell," Catherine cut in sharply, "I advise you not to speak further without consulting your attorney. The documents we've presented raise serious concerns about potential criminal violations, including fraud, tax evasion, and wire fraud." Whitman placed a restraining hand on Ryan's arm, then leaned forward. "I think we need to suspend this deposition temporarily while I confer with my client." "Actually, Mr. Whitman," came a new voice from the doorway, "you might want to consider whether you can continue representing Mr. Mitchell at all." James Harrington, the former federal prosecutor, entered the room followed by his associate, Rebecca Diaz, James Harrington's special counsel. "Based on the evidence presented, there's a significant question of whether you had prior knowledge of your client's fraudulent financial activities." Whitman's face, already pale, took on an ashen quality. "I assure you, I had no knowledge of any— Your law firm's consultation records show that you met with Mr. Mitchell 3 months ago, immediately after the death of Mrs. Mitchell's grandmother," Rebecca interjected, placing another document on the table. "Notes from that meeting reference strategic timing relative to expected inheritance, and optimal asset positioning pre-filing." She smiled thinly. "That suggests knowledge of and participation in a fraudulent scheme to misappropriate separately inherited property." The tension in the room was palpable. Ryan stared at the evidence spread across the table, the full impact of his exposure clearly dawning on him. Whitman's professional composure was cracking, the realization that he might be implicated in his client's schemes visibly settling over him. "Here's what's going to happen now," Catherine said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "This deposition is concluded. We will be filing amended divorce petitions outlining Mr. Mitchell's fraudulent behavior and hidden assets. We will be requesting an emergency freeze on all identified accounts and properties pending full forensic accounting." She paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "Additionally, we have already forwarded evidence of potential criminal activity to the appropriate authorities for their review." Ryan finally broke. "Olivia, please," he said, his voice cracking. "We can work this out. Everything I did, it was for us, for our future." I looked at my husband, this stranger I had loved and trusted for 6 years, and felt nothing but a cold clarity. "There is no us, Ryan. There is no our future. You saw me as nothing but a path to money. You lied to me for years while I supported you, believing in you, trusting you. You were planning to take what my grandmother left me and disappear. That's not love. That's not a marriage. That's fraud." Ryan's face contorted, shifting rapidly between desperation, anger, and calculation as he searched for an angle, a manipulation that might still work. "Olivia, you're emotional right now. You're not thinking clearly. If you'd just let me explain." "I think the documents explain everything quite clearly," I replied, my voice steady. "Your own words, Ryan. Your own plans, spelled out in detail. How much clearer could it be?" Gordon Whitman had recovered some of his professional composure, though the sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed his stress. "Mrs. Mitchell, regardless of these allegations, divorce proceedings still require negotiation. Perhaps after everyone has had time to consider their positions." Catherine cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Mr. Whitman, let me be perfectly clear. This is no longer a negotiation. This is a notification of what will happen next. Your client has committed fraud. He has systematically hidden assets. He has documented, in his own words, a plan to misappropriate separately inherited funds. The only negotiation that remains is whether your client wishes to accept a settlement that might avoid criminal prosecution. James Harrington placed a slim folder on the table. This contains our initial settlement terms. They are non-negotiable and time-sensitive. Mr. Mitchell will relinquish all claims to Mrs. Mitchell's inheritance. He will provide full disclosure of all hidden assets, including those not yet identified. He will transfer ownership of the Lake Geneva property to Mrs. Mitchell as compensatory damages. Ryan stared at the folder as if it might bite him. This is extortion. You can't. It's not extortion, Mr. Mitchell, Rebecca Diaz interjected coolly. It's consequence. The alternative is that we proceed with full litigation and criminal referrals. The choice is yours. Whitman reached for the folder, opening it with visible reluctance. As he scanned the terms, his expression grew increasingly grim. He leaned over to whisper something to Ryan, who jerked back as if slapped. "This is insane," Ryan hissed. "She's trying to ruin me, after everything I've done for her." "Everything you've done?" I repeated, unable to contain my disbelief. "You mean lying about your business being in trouble while you hid profits offshore? Making me live on my teacher's salary and budget every penny while you secretly bought a lake house? Planning to divorce me after stealing my inheritance? That's what you've done for me?" Ryan's face darkened. "You wouldn't have that inheritance if it weren't for me. I'm the one who visited your grandmother regularly, who helped her around the house when you were too busy with your precious students. I earned that money." The mask had finally slipped completely. This was the real Ryan Mitchell, entitled Calculating, believing he deserved to steal from his wife because he had performed basic human decency for her elderly grandmother. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Catherine said, with the satisfaction of someone who has just watched their opponent make a fatal error. That statement is now part of the official record. Your claim that you earned Mrs. Mitchell's inheritance through your relationship with her grandmother will be particularly interesting to the court. Whitman closed his eyes briefly, visibly pained by his client's outburst. When he opened them, the fight had gone out of him. He was now in full damage control mode. "We would like to request a brief recess to review these terms," he said formally. Catherine nodded. "You have 1 hour. The offer expires after that." As Catherine and I prepared to leave the conference room, I paused, turning back to look at Ryan one last time. The man I had loved, had built a life with, had trusted with everything. He sat slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat, all his careful plans and manipulations exposed to the harsh light of truth. "One question, Ryan," I said quietly. "Was any of it real? Did you ever actually love me?" Ryan looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I had believed him to be, capable of genuine emotion, of connection beyond calculation. Then his expression hardened. "Would it matter if I said yes?" he asked coldly. I considered this, then shook my head. "No, I guess it wouldn't. Not anymore." As Catherine and I walked out, leaving Ryan to face the consequences of his actions, I felt an unexpected lightness. The pain was still there, the betrayal still raw, but beneath it was something new. Freedom. Freedom from deception, from manipulation, from a marriage that had been built on lies. Gordon Whitman's face as I walked out, a mixture of professional, humiliation and dawning recognition of his own potential liability, was something I would remember for a long time. But it wasn't his expression that mattered most to me. It was my own reflection I caught in the mirrored wall of the reception area as we left. A woman standing tall, eyes clear, facing the future on her own terms. That was the image I would carry. Forward. Catherine and I sat in a cafe across from Whitman and Associates, waiting for their response to our settlement terms. The weight of the confrontation had lifted, replaced by a strange, hollow calm. "What happens now?" I asked, my untouched coffee growing cold. "Either they accept our terms, recognizing it's their best option, or we proceed with litigation and criminal referrals," Catherine replied with the confidence of someone who had seen this scenario many times before. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, her phone rang. After a brief conversation, she turned to me with satisfaction. "They've accepted. We'll have a signed agreement by end of day." The settlement arrived by courier hours later, Ryan's signature already on the document, the familiar scrawl somehow smaller than I remembered. As I signed my name on the final page, officially ending my marriage, I felt a complex wave of emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, and beneath it all, a tentative sense of hope. That evening at Melissa's house, I finally began processing everything. My phone remained silent. No calls or texts from Ryan. I wondered what he was doing now, how he was coping with the collapse of his plans. "So, what happens now? With the lake house and everything?" Melissa asked, handing me a glass of wine. "The property transfer should be completed within 30 days. Ryan has to document all his hidden accounts within 2 weeks, and any diverted marital assets will be returned. And the inheritance? Completely protected. The trust ensures Ryan can't touch a penny of it." The next morning brought an unexpected development, a call from Detective Sarah Reeves with the Financial Crimes Unit. "We've reviewed the materials forwarded to our department," she explained. "The documentation suggests potential criminal violations that warrant investigation. Tax evasion, wire fraud, possibly other financial crimes." After agreeing to meet with the detective, I called Catherine, who wasn't surprised. The evidence was too substantial to ignore from a criminal perspective. "How do you feel about it? Did I want Ryan to face criminal charges? To potentially go to prison?" The anger and hurt were still raw, but the thought of being responsible for sending him to jail was unsettling. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me feels he deserves consequences beyond just losing the money, but another part feels conflicted about being the catalyst for criminal prosecution of someone you once loved," Catherine finished. "That's normal, Olivia, but remember, you didn't create this situation. You simply uncovered the truth." That afternoon, after meeting with Detective Reeves, I received an email from Ryan. I considered deleting it unread, but curiosity won out. He claimed he'd been drowning for years, that the business had been near bankruptcy, that he'd created an illusion of success while fighting desperately to make it real. The inheritance had seemed like providence, he wrote, the answer to years of struggle. I know now how deluded that thinking was. How selfish. The worst loss is knowing your last memory of me will be as a thief and a liar, not as the man who truly did love you, despite my terrible choices. I stared at the screen, emotions churning. Part of me wanted to find some remnant of the man I thought I had married in these words, but the evidence told a different story, of calculated deception spanning years, of a husband who had seen his wife as a means to an end. After a moment's hesitation, I deleted the email without responding. Some betrayals cut too deep for words to heal. Whatever Ryan's rationalizations now that his schemes had collapsed, they couldn't undo what he had done or what I had discovered about the man behind the mask. 3 weeks after the settlement, I stood on the deck of the Lake Geneva property, watching sunset colors ripple across the water. The house was exactly what you'd expect from Ryan. Modern, expensive, designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows, high-end appliances, and a master suite larger than my first apartment. "Keep it or sell it?" Melissa asked, joining me with 2 glasses of wine. "I'm not sure. It's beautiful, but it was Ryan's secret escape plan," she finished. "Exactly. Every time I look at that fireplace, I imagine him sitting there, congratulating himself on successfully taking my inheritance." "Then change it," Melissa suggested. "Make it unrecognizable. Reimagine the space until there's nothing of him left in it." Her suggestion resonated, not just reclaiming a physical space, but reclaiming my narrative. My life had been shaped by Ryan's lies for years. This house represented an opportunity to reshape something on my own terms. The rebuilding process had already begun in other ways. I had returned to teaching, finding solace in the structure of my classroom. I had started therapy, working through the complex emotions of betrayal. And I had begun the practical process of disentangling my life from Ryan's. New accounts, new contact information, new routines. News about Ryan came in fragments. His business was in receivership. He had moved out of our house. The criminal investigation was proceeding, with indictments expected soon. I had moments of guilt about his situation, quickly followed by anger at myself for feeling guilty. Catherine's words would echo. You didn't create this situation. You simply uncovered the truth. Still, untangling emotions was more complex than untangling finances. 6 years of marriage couldn't be erased by legal documents or rational understanding of his betrayal. I still found myself reaching for him in the morning. I still caught myself buying his favorite snacks. I still felt the phantom weight of my wedding ring. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Diana West, the private investigator who had helped uncover Ryan's documents. There's a distinct pattern in these cases, she wrote. First, survival, securing your position legally and financially. Then processing, working through the emotional impact. But there's a third phase many miss: reclamation. Not just of assets, but of personal identity and future vision. Your grandmother's inheritance wasn't just money, it was a gift of possibilities. How you choose to use it is perhaps the most significant reclamation of all. The next morning, I woke early and sat with a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote, Reclamation Plan. For 2 hours, I filled pages with thoughts, ideas, and goals that had nothing to do with Ryan or the divorce. Dreams I had set aside during our marriage, places I wanted to visit, changes to my career path, ways I might use my inheritance to create meaning rather than just financial security. The following week, I met with a financial advisor to create a comprehensive plan for my newfound security. Together, we structured my inheritance into 3 components: a retirement fund, an investment portfolio, and what she called a purpose fund for meaningful projects. What kind of purposes? She asked. A scholarship fund for first generation. College students. Going back to school myself for educational leadership, and writing a book about financial literacy for women, particularly around preventing financial abuse in relationships. She smiled. These aren't just ways to spend money, they're investments in your values and the impact you want to have. As spring turned to summer, my new life began taking shape. I found a charming apartment in a neighborhood I'd always loved. I enrolled in a master's program. I started reimagining the lake house with colors and textures that felt authentically mine. Ryan accepted a plea deal on reduced charges, receiving 15 months in federal prison. When Catherine called about the outcome, I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness, anger, but primarily closure. How do you feel about the sentence? She asked. Like justice was served, but there's no satisfaction in it. What he did deserved consequences, but watching someone I once loved face those consequences, it's not triumphant. It's just sad. Many clients would feel vindicated, she observed. I'm finding my vindication elsewhere, I told her. In building something new, rather, than focusing on his punishment. 1 year after discovering Ryan's betrayal, I hosted a gathering at the transformed lake house. The space that had once been designed for his post-divorce life now embodied my vision entirely. Warm woods replaced cold modernism, comfortable seating replaced angular furniture, personal art replaced generic abstracts. Nothing remained of his presence. The occasion marked the launch of the Mitchell Education Foundation, funded by a portion of my inheritance. providing scholarships for disadvantaged students and supporting innovative teaching programs throughout the district. "If I could have everyone's attention," Melissa called out. Our hostess has a few words. As conversations quieted, I felt a momentary flutter of nerves, quickly replaced by calm certainty. These people, some longtime friends, others new allies, represented the community I had created in the aftermath of betrayal. A year ago, I could never have imagined standing in this house, let alone filling it with friends to celebrate a new beginning, I began. This house has a complicated history. It was purchased secretly as part of someone else's exit strategy from our marriage. When I first saw it after our divorce, I couldn't imagine ever feeling comfortable here. But then I realized something important. Places don't have power over us. We have power over places. We imbue them with meaning through our choices, our creativity, our purpose. What was once a symbol of betrayal could become something entirely different if I chose to transform it. I gestured to the space around us, now warm and welcoming. That transformation became a metaphor for my larger journey, taking what was painful and reshaping it into something meaningful, finding purpose in adversity. The Mitchell Education Foundation transforms an inheritance that someone attempted to misappropriate into an enduring legacy of opportunity. So today, we're celebrating more than a renovated house or a new foundation. We're celebrating the power of transformation in spaces, in circumstances, and most importantly, in ourselves. As glasses were raised in response, I felt the weight of my journey. From the shocked, betrayed woman who had discovered her husband's scheme to the confident, purposeful person I had become. Later, Catherine found me by the lakefront windows. "You've created something remarkable here," she said. "In my 27 years practicing divorce law, I've seen countless responses to betrayal. Some never recover. They remain defined by what was done to them." "And others?" I prompted. "Others do what you've done. They use the experience as a catalyst rather than an endpoint. They build lives that would have been unimaginable had the betrayal never occurred. Not because betrayal is a gift, but because their response to it reveals strengths they never knew they possessed." As the evening came to a close and the last guests departed, I stood alone on the deck watching moonlight dance across the lake. In the distance, a loon called, its haunting cry echoing across the water. 2 years ago, I had been living in what I thought was a supportive marriage, unaware of the deception surrounding me. 1 year ago, I had been fighting to protect what was rightfully mine, navigating the shock and pain of betrayal. Now I stood in a home that was truly mine, surrounded by a life I had consciously created. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. Some wounds leave permanent marks, but those marks no longer defined me. They had become part of a larger story. One, of resilience, reclamation, and renewal. I thought about the women I'd met through my advocacy work on financial literacy. Women still trapped in manipulative relationships, women fighting their way out, women rebuilding after betrayal. I had discovered that sharing my story helped others find their courage, just as Catherine and Diana had once helped me find mine. My phone chimed with a message, a simple text from Melissa. "Proud of you, warrior woman." I smiled, typing back, "Not a warrior, just a woman who refused to be a victim." The lake house lights reflected in the dark water, creating a double image, the physical structure and its shimmering reflection. Similarly, I now understood that crisis reveals character, showing us not just who we are in adversity, but who we might become through it. Ryan had thought he knew me, had believed I was someone who could be manipulated, deceived, and discarded. Once my inheritance arrived. His fundamental misunderstanding had been his downfall. In trying to take what was mine, he had inadvertently given me something far more valuable, the opportunity to discover my own strength, resilience, and capacity for transformation. I had not just reclaimed my inheritance, I had reclaimed myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.